Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time.
Charles of Savoy did not reflect that the victories of brute force, such as those he was now winning, but paved the way for moral triumphs. With every head that fell by his executioners, he deems himself a stage nearer to the success he panted to attain. Some illustrious heads had already fallen, so many more, say 20, or it might be 30, and he would be Lord of Geneva. The small but much coveted principality would be part of Savoy, and the object so intently pursued by himself and his ancestors for long years would be realized. The Duke was but practicing a deception upon himself. Every head he cut off dug more deeply the gulf which divided him from the sovereignty of Geneva. Every drop of blood he spilled but strengthened the resolution in the hearts of the patriots that never should the Duke call them his subjects. They never fail who die in a great cause. The block soaked their gore. Their heads may be sodden in the sun, their limbs be strung to city gates and castle walls, but still their spirit walks abroad, though years elapse. The others share as dark a doom, but they augment the deep and sweeping thoughts, which overpower all others and conduct the world at last to freedom. Nevertheless, what with stratagem this hour and violence the next, treachery within Geneva, and soldiers and cannon outside of it, it did seem as if the Duke were making way, and the proud little city must, by and by, lay its independence at his feet. In fact, for a moment, Geneva did succumb. On the 15th of September, 1525, the Duke surprised the city with a numerous host. The patriots had nothing left them but massacre or speedy flight, fleeing through woods or mountainous defiles, pursued by Savoyard archers. Some escaped to Bern, others to Freiburg. The Duke, having entered the city, summoned a council of such citizens as were still to be found in it, and with axes of his halberders suspended over their heads, these spiritless and lukewarm men promised to accept him as their prince. But the vow of allegiance given in the Council of Halberds today was revoked on the morrow. The Duke was at first stunned, and next he was terrified at this sudden revival of opposition, when he believed it had been trampled out. Influenced by this mysterious fear, he hastily left Geneva, never again to enter it, and let it fall, after having seemingly secured it, what he and his ancestors had been struggling for generations to grasp. The Duke had but scattered the fire, not extinguished it. The parts of Switzerland to which the patriots had fled were precisely those where the light of the Reformation was breaking. At Bern and Freiburg, the exiles of Geneva had an opportunity of studying higher models of freedom than any they had hitherto come in contact with. They had been sent to school, and their hearts, softened by adversity, were all the more open to the higher teaching now addressed to them. How often in later years was the same thing repeated which we see realized in the case of these early champions of freedom. Were not the patriotic citizens of Spain and Italy again and again chased to the British shores? And for what end? that there they might study purer models, be instructed in deeper and sounder principles, have their views of liberty rectified and enlarged, and on their return to their own country, right temper their zeal and patience, fortify their courage with wisdom, and so speed the better in their efforts for the emancipation of their fellow subjects. Fruitful indeed were the months which the Genevese exiles spent abroad. When they returned in February 1526, after the flight of the Duke, a new era returned with them. Their sufferings had elicited the sympathy, and their characters had won the admiration of the noblest among the citizens of the states where they had been sojourning. They recognized the important bearing upon Swiss liberty of the struggle which Geneva had maintained. It was the extreme citadel of the Swiss territories towards the south. It barred the invaders' road from the Alps, and it was impossible to withhold from the little town the meed of praise for the chivalry and devotion with which, single-handed, it had taken its stand at the Swiss Thermopylae, and held it at all hazards. But it was not right, they felt, to leave the city longer in isolation, for their own sakes as well as for Geneva's. They must extend the hand of friendship to it. An alliance, offensive and defensive, was formed between the three governments of Bern, Freiburg, and Geneva. If the conflicts of the latter city were not yet ended, it no longer stood alone. By its side were now two powerful allies. Whoso touched its independence touched theirs. If the gospel had not yet entered Geneva, its gates stood open towards that quarter of the sky which the rising sun of the Reformation was flooding with its beams. Chapter 3. The Reform commenced in Lausanne and established at Morat and Neuchatel. Geneva on the road to liberty. Her advance. There needs the sword of the Spirit to conquer her highest liberty. Farel. No second field of Capelle. Farel goes to Aigle as schoolmaster. Begins to preach. Commotion. Retires from Aigle. Leaves behind him a little Reformed church. Goes to Morat, then an important town. Eventually won to the gospel. Attempts Lausanne. Goes to Neuchatel. Crowds flock to his preaching. Plants the Reformed faith at Myri in the neighboring Jura. Returns to Neuchatel. Carries its Reformation by a coup. Geneva had gone a long way towards independence. It had chased the Duke across the mountains to return no more. It had formed an alliance with Bern and Freiburg without waiting for the consent of its prince-bishop. This was in effect to hold its temporal authority null and to take the sovereignty into its own hands. Liberty had advanced a stage on its road. Free Europe had enlarged its area, and that bond Europe had, to the same extent, been circumscribed. Rome saw the outposts of progress so much nearer her own gates. The Pope beheld bold and spirited citizens ignoring the scepter of their prince-bishop, converting it into a bauble, and the thought must have suggested itself to him, might not the day come when his own more powerful rod would be plucked from his hands and broken in pieces like that of his vassal bishop in Geneva? But though on the road, Geneva had not yet arrived at the goal. She was not yet crowned with perfect liberty. A powerful oppressor had her in his grip, namely Rome. The tyrant, it is true, had been compelled to relax his hold, but he might tighten his grasp unless Geneva could succeed in entirely disengaging herself. But she had not yet got hold of the right weapon for such a battle. Berthelier assailed Rome on the ground of ancient charters. Bonivard hurled against her the shafts of a revived learning. Leverrier maintained the fight with the sword of justice, but it needed that a more powerful sword. Even that of the word of the living God should be unsheathed before the tyrant could be wholly discomfited and the victory completely won. That sword had been unsheathed, and the champions who were wielding it, advancing in their victorious path, were every day coming nearer the gates of Geneva. When this new liberty should be enthroned within her, then would her light break forth as the morning, and the black clouds which had so long hung about her would be scattered, and the tyrants who had plotted her overthrow would tremble at her name, and stand afar off for the fear of that invisible arm that guarded her. Let us turn to the movements outside the city, which, without concert on the part of their originators, fall in with the efforts of the champions within it for the complete emancipation of Geneva. We have already met Farel. We have seen him a mere lad descending from the mountains of Dauphine, entering himself a pupil into that renowned seminary of knowledge and orthodoxy, the Sorbonne, contracting a close friendship with its most illustrious doctor, Lefebvre, accompanying him in his daily visits to the shrines of the metropolis, and kneeling by the side of the venerable man before the images of the saints. But soon the eyes of both teacher and pupil were open, and Farel, transferring that ardor of soul which had characterized him as a papist to the side of the Reformation, strove to rescue others from the frightful abyss of superstition in which he himself had been so near perishing. Chased from France, as we have already related, he turned his steps towards Switzerland. It is the second Reformation in Switzerland that we are now briefly to sketch. The commencement and progress of the first we have already traced, beginning with the preaching of Zwingli in the convent of Einsiedeln. The movement in that little time transferred itself to Zurich, and thence it rapidly spread to the neighboring towns and cantons in eastern Helvetia, extending from Basel on the frontier of Germany in the north to Coire on the borders of Italy on the south. The forest cantons, however, continued obedient to Rome. The adherents of the old faith and the champions of the new met on the bloody field of Capelle. The sword gave the victory to Romanism. The bravest and best of the citizens of Zurich lay stretched upon the battlefield. Among the slain was Zwingli. With him, so men said and believed at the moment, had fallen the Reformation. In the grave of its most eloquent preacher and its most courageous defender lay interred the hopes of Swiss Protestantism. But though the calamity of Capelle arrested, it did not extinguish the movement. On the contrary, it tended eventually to consolidate and quicken it by impressing upon its friends the necessity of union. In later years, when Geneva came to occupy the place in the second Helvetian movement, which Zurich had done in the first, the division among the reformed cantons, which had led to the terrible disaster of 1531, was avoided, and there was no second field of Capelle. Arriving in Switzerland 1526, Farel took up his abode at Aigle, and there commenced that campaign which had for its object to conquer to Christ a brave and hardy people dwelling amid the glaciers of the eternal mountains, or in fertile and sunny valleys, or on the shores of the smiling lakes. The darkness of ages overhung the region, but Farel had brought hither the light. Taking the name of Urson, says Rouquat, and acting the part of a schoolmaster, he mingled with the elements of secular instruction, the seed of divine knowledge. Through the minds of the children he gained access to those of the parents, and when he had gathered a little flock around him, he threw off his disguise and announced himself as William Farel, the minister. Though he had dropped from the clouds, the priests could not have been more affrighted, nor the people more surprised than they were at the sudden metamorphosis of the schoolmaster. Farel instantly mounted the pulpit. His bold look, his burning eye, his voice of thunder, his words, rapid, eloquent, and stamped with the majesty of truth, reached the conscience and increased the number of those in the valley of Eglah who were already prepared to take the word of God for their guide. But not by one sermon can the prejudice of ages be dispelled. The Curies were filled with wrath at the bold intruder who had entered their quiet valley, had shaken their authority, till now so secure, and had disturbed beliefs as ancient and as firmly founded, the mountaineers believed, as the peaks that overhung their valley. The priests and people raised a great clamor, being supported by the cantonal officials, in particular by Jacob de Riveria, Lord of Crete, and Syndic of Eglah. Hearing of the opposition, the lords of Bern, whose jurisdiction comprehended Eglah and its neighborhood, sent a commission to Farel empowering him to explain the scriptures to the people. The mandate was posted up on the church doors, but instead of calming the tempest, this intervention of authority only stirred it into a fourfold fury. It would seem as if the gospel would conquer alone, or not at all. The priests burned with zeal for the safety of those flocks to whom they had hardly ever addressed a word of instruction. The syndic took their side, and the placards of the magistrates of Bern were torn down. "That cannot be the gospel of Christ," said the priests, "seeing the preaching of it does not bring peace but war." This enlightened logic, alike with that which would accuse the singing of the nightingale in a Swiss valley as the cause of the descent of the avalanches, convinced the mountaineers. The inhabitants of the 4 districts into which the territory of Eglah was divided, namely Eglah, Ben, Aulon, and the Ormonds, as one man unsheathed the sword. The shepherds who fled their flocks beneath the glaciers of the Diblerets, hearing that the church was in danger, rushed like an avalanche to the rescue. The herdsmen of the Savoy Mountains, crossing the Rhone, also hastened to do battle in the good old cause. Tumults broke out at Ben and Aulon and other places. Farel saw the tempest gathering, but remained undismayed. Those who had received the gospel from him were prepared to defend him. But were it not better to prevent the effusion of blood, to which the matter was fast tending, and go and preach the gospel in other parts of this lovely but benighted land? This was the course he adopted, but in retiring he had the satisfaction of thinking that he had planted the standard of the cross at the foot of the mighty Dent de Morcles, and that he left behind him men whose eyes had been opened and who would never again bow the knee to the idols their fathers had served. Soon thereafter, Eglah and Ben, by majorities, gave their voices for the reform, but the parishes that lay higher up amid the mountains declared that they would abide in the old faith. Where should Farel go next? Looking from the point where the Rhone, rolling under the sublime peaks of the Dent de Midi and the Dent de Morcles, pours its discolored floods into the crystal Leman, one espies, on the other side of the lake, the vine-clad hill on which Lausanne is seated. In Popish times, this was a city of importance. Its tall cathedral towers soared aloft on their commanding site, while the lovely region held fast the yoke of the Pope, slumbered at their feet. Lausanne had bishops, a college of rich canons, and a numerous staff of priests. It had besides an annual fair, to which troops of pilgrims resorted, to pray before the images of Our Lady, and to buy indulgences and other trinkets, a traffic that enriched at once the church and the townspeople. But though one could hardly stir a step in the streets without meeting a holy man or pious pilgrim, the place was a very sink of corruption. There was need, verily, of a purifying stream being turned in upon this filthy place. Farel essayed to do so, but his first attempt was not successful. He turned away upon another tack. Repulsed from Lausanne, Farel traveled the fertile country which divides the Leman from the lake of Neuchatel, and arrived at Morat. This, in our day, insignificant place was then a renowned and fortified town. It had sustained 3 famous sieges, the first in 1032 against the Emperor Conrad, the second in 1291 against the Emperor Rudolph of Habsburg, and the third in 1476 against Charles, the last Duke of Burgundy. Situated between France and Germany, the 2 languages were spoken equally in it. Farel brought with him an authorization from the Lords of Bern empowering him to preach, not only throughout the extent of their own territories, but also in that of their allies, provided they gave consent. Here his preaching was not without fruit, but the majority of the citizens, electing to abide still by Rome, he retraced his steps, and presented himself a second time before that episcopal city that overlooks the Blue Leman, and which had so recently driven him from its gates. He was ambitious of subduing the stronghold of darkness to the Savior. This time he brought with him a letter from the Lords of Bern, who had jurisdiction in those parts, and naturally wished to see their allies of the same faith with themselves. But even this failed to procure him liberty to evangelize in Lausanne. The Council of 60 read the letter of their Excellencies of Bern, and civilly replied that it belonged not to them, but to the bishop and chapter to admit preachers into the pulpits. The Council of 200 also found that they had no power in the matter. Farel had again to depart and leave those whom he would have led into the pastures of truth, to the care of shepherds who knew so ill to feed, but were so skillful to fleece their flocks. Again turning northward, he made his short halt at Morat. This time the victory of the gospel was complete, and this important town was placed, 1529, in the list of Protestant cities. Farel felt that mighty unseen power was traveling with him, opening the understandings, melting the hearts of men, and he would press on and win other cities and cantons to the gospel. He crossed the lovely lake and presented himself in Neuchatel, which had lately returned under the scepter of its former mistress, Jeanne de Hochberg, the only daughter and heiress of Philip, Count of Neuchatel, who died in 1503. She regained in her widowhood the principality of Neuchatel, which she had lost in the lifetime of her husband, Louis d'Orléans, Duke of Longueville. No one could enter the city without having ocular demonstration that religion was the dominant interest in it, meaning thereby a great cathedral on a conspicuous site, with full complement of canons, priests, and monks, who furnished the usual store of pomp, dramas, indulgences, banqueting, and scandals. In the midst of a devotion of this sort, Neuchatel was startled by a man of small stature, red beard, glittering eye, and stentorian voice, who stood up in the midst of the marketplace, and announced that he had brought a religion not from Rome, but from the Bible. The men with shaven crowns were struck dumb with astonishment. When at length they found their voices, they said, "Let us beat out his brains." "Duck him, duck him," cried others. They fought with such weapons as they had. Their ignorance forbade their opposing doctrine with doctrine. Farel lifted up his voice above their clamor. His preaching was felt to be not an idle tale, nor a piece of incomprehensible mysticism, but words of power, the words of God. Neuchatel was carried by storm. It did not as yet formally declare for reform, but it was soon to do so. Having kindled the fire, and knowing that all the efforts of the priests would not succeed in extinguishing it, Farel departed to evangelize in the mountains and valleys which lie around the smiling waters of Morat and Neuchatel. It was winter, January 1530, and cold. Hunger and weariness were his frequent attendants. Every hour, moreover, he was in peril of his life. The priests perfectly understood that if they did not make away with him, he would make away with religion, that is, their tithes and offerings, their processions and orgies. They did all in their power to save religion. They suspended their quarrels with one another. They stole some hours from their sleep. They even stole some hours from the table in their zeal to warn their flocks against the wolf and impress them with a salutary dread of what their fate would be should they become his prey. On one occasion, in the Val de Ruse, in the mountains that overhang the lake of Neuchatel, the reformer was seized and beaten almost to death. Nothing, however, could stop him. He would at times mount the pulpit while the priest was in the act of celebrating the Mass at the altar, and drown the chants of the Missal by the thunder of his eloquence. This boldness had diverse results. Sometimes the old bigotry would resume its sway, and the audience would pull the preacher violently out of the pulpit. At other times the arrow of conviction would enter. The priest would hastily strip himself of stole and chasuble, and cast the implements of sacrifice from his hands, while the congregation would demolish the altar, remove the images, and give their adhesion to the new faith. In 3 weeks' time, 4 villages of the region had embraced the Reformed faith. The first of these was the village of Kurtzers, the church of which had been given in the year 962 to the Abbey of Payerne by Queen Bertha, wife of Rudolph II, King of Burgundy, foundress of the abbey. Since that time, that is, during 468 years, the religious of Payerne had been the patrons of that church, the curé of which was their vicar. As the Reformed were no longer served by him, they petitioned their superiors at Bern for a Reformed pastor. Their request was granted, and it was arranged that the popish curé and the Protestant minister should divide the stipend between them. The cups, pictures, marbles, and other valuables of the church were sold, and therewith were provided stipends for the pastors, hospitals for the poor and sick, schools for the youth, and if aught remained, it was given to the state. The zeal of the citizens of Myri outran their discretion. They overturned the altars and images before the Reformation had obtained a majority of votes. This furnished occasion to the lords of Freiburg to complain to those of Bern that their subjects in the Jura were infringing the settlement that regulated the progress of the Protestant faith. A few weeks, however, put it all right by giving a majority of votes in Myri to the Reformation. Thus did the gospel cast down strongholds of error, and its preacher, in the midst of weakness, was triumphant. The spring and summer sufficed to establish the Reformed faith in great part of this region. The Protestant hero Farel was now advancing to complete his conquest of Neuchatel. During his absence, the Reformation had been fermenting. He entered the city at the right moment. Despite the opposition of the princess, of George de Rive, her deputy, and the priests who sounded the tocsin to rouse the people, the magistrates, after deliberation, passed a decree opening the cathedral to the Reformed worship, and the citizens forming round Farel and climbing the hill on which the cathedral stood, placed him in the pulpit, notwithstanding the resistance of the canons. The solemnity of the crisis hushed the vast congregation into stillness. Farel's sermon was one of the most powerful he had ever delivered, and when he closed, lo, a mighty wind, felt though it could not be seen, passed over the people. They all at once cried out, "We will follow the Protestant religion, both we and our children, and in it we will live and die." Having restored the gospel with its sublime doctrines and its worship in the Spirit, the Neuchatelans felt that they had no longer need of those symbols by which popery sets forth its mysteries, and through which the material worship of its votaries is offered. They proceeded therewith to purge the church. They dismantled the altars, broke the images, tore down the pictures and crucifixes, and carrying them out, cast them down from the summit of the terrace on which the cathedral stands. At their feet slept the blue lake. Beyond was the fertile Champagne, and afar in the south a chain of glittering peaks, with the snowy crown of Mont Blanc rising grandly over all. But not an eye that day was turned on this glorious panorama. They had broken from their own and their children's neck an ancient yoke, and were intent only on obliterating all the signs and instruments of their former slavery. In perpetual remembrance of this great day, the Neuchatelans inscribed on a pillar of the cathedral the words, "On the 23rd of October, 1530, idolatry was overthrown and removed from this church by the citizens." Chapter 4. Tumults, Successes, Toleration. Second vote on religion at Neuchatel. Valingen. Disgraceful trick. Popular tempest. Triumph of reform. Farel turns his eye toward Geneva. Evangelist at Orb. Makes a beginning. First communion at Orb. Peter Farel, his character. Goes to grandson. A battle in the church. The affair carried to the conference at Bern. Protestant Bern and Catholic Freiburg agree on a policy of toleration. Great success of Farel. He turns toward Geneva. Was the storm that swept over Neuchatel on the 23rd of October, and which cleansed its cathedral of the emblems of superstition, a passing gust, or one of those great waves which indicate the rising of the tide in the spiritual atmosphere? Was it an outburst of mob violence provoked by the greed and tyranny of the priests, or was it the strong and emphatically expressed resolution of men who knew and loved the truth? If the former, the idols would again be set up. If the latter, they had fallen to rise no more. This was tested on the 4th of November following. On that eventful day, the citizens of Neuchatel, climbing the hill on which stood the governor's castle, hard by the cathedral that still bore traces of the recent tempest, in altars overturned, niches empty, and images disfigured, presented themselves before the governor and deputies from Bern. They had assembled to vote on the question whether Romanism or Protestantism should be the religion of Neuchatel. A majority of 18 votes gave the victory to the Reformation. From that day, November 4th, 1530, conscience was free in Neuchatel. No one was compelled to abandon popery, but the cathedral was henceforward appropriated to the Protestant worship, and the Reformation was legally established. Valingen, the town of next importance in this part of the Jura, followed soon thereafter the example of Neuchatel. The issue here was precipitated by a shameful expedient to which the Papists had recourse, and which was of a sort that history refuses to chronicle. It was a fair day. Antoine Marcourt, the pastor of Neuchatel, was preaching in the marketplace. A large and attentive congregation was listening to him, when a revolting spectacle was exhibited which was contrived to affront the preacher, insult the audience, and drive the gospel from the place amid jeers and laughter. The trick recoiled upon its authors. It was popery that had to flee. A sudden gust of indignation shook the crowd. The multitudes rushed toward the cathedral. Who shall now save the saints? The priests have unchained winds which it is beyond their power to control. Altar, image, and monumental statue all went down before the tempest. The relics were scattered about. Even the rich oriels which, flecked with their glorious tints, stone floor and massive column, were not spared. The edifice, all aglow but a few moments before with the curious and beautiful picturings of chisel and pencil, was now a wreck. The popular vengeance was not yet appeased. The furious multitude was next seen directing its course toward the residences of the canons. The terrified clerics had already fled to the woods, but if their persons escaped, their houses were sacked. By and by the storm spent itself, and calmer feelings returned to the breasts of the citizens. They ascended the hill on which stood the castle of the Countess of Arburg, who governed Valingen under the suzerainty of Bern. The authorities trembled when they saw them approach, and were greatly relieved when they learned that they had come with no more hostile intent than to demand the punishment of the perpetrators of the outrage. The Countess gave orders for the punishment of the guilty, though she was suspected of connivance in the affair. As to all beyond, the matter was referred to Bern, and their excellencies decided that the townspeople should pay for the works of art which had been destroyed, and that the Countess in return should grant the free profession of the Reformed faith. The sum in which the citizens were immersed we do not know, but it must have been large indeed, for it did not leave them any profit by the exchange. By a sort of intuition, it was Geneva that Farel all along had in his eye. The victories which he won, and won with such rapidity and brilliancy at the foot of the Jura and on the shores of its lakes, were but affairs of outposts. They were merely stepping stones upon his road toward the conquest of that heroic little city which occupied a site where three great empires touched one another, and where he longed to plant the Protestant standard. The idea was ever borne in upon his mind that Geneva had a great part before it, that it was destined to become the capital of Swiss Protestantism, and, in part, of French and Savoy Protestantism also. For its higher destiny he did not dare to forecast, therefore he rejoiced in every victory he gained, seeing himself so much the nearer what he felt must be his crowning conquest. But like a wise general, he would not advance too fast. He would leave behind him no post of the enemy untaken. He intended that Geneva should be conquered once and for all. He would enter its gates only after he had subdued the country around, and hang out the banner of the gospel upon its ramparts when Geneva had become mistress of a renovated region, and it pleased the captain whom he served to give him his desire. There was a short halt in the march of this spiritual conqueror. At St. Blaise, on the northern shore of the lake of Neuchatel, Farel was set upon by a mob, instigated by the priests, and almost beaten to death. Covered with bruises, spitting blood, and so disfigured as scarcely to be recognized by his friends, he was put into a small boat and carried across the lake and nursed at Morat. He had barely recovered his strength when he rose from the bed and set out for Orbe to evangelize. Orbe was an ancient town at the foot of the Jura, on the picturesque banks of a stream of the same name. It lay near Geneva, the Neuchatel. Watered by rivulets from the mountains, the gardens that surrounded it were of more than ordinary beauty and luxuriance. But spiritually, Orbe was a wilderness, a land where no water was. The reformer would have given it living water, but unhappily Orbe, with its numerous priests, its rich convents, and its famous sisters of St. Clare, some of whom were of royal lineage, did not thirst for such water. Its good Catholics strove to render Farel's journey of no avail. With this view they had recourse to expedients, some of which were tragic, others simply ludicrous. One of them is worth chronicling for its originality. It was agreed to outmaneuver the evangelist by staying away, a masterly policy in the case of a preacher so attractive, but in one instance the policy was departed from. One day, when Farel entered the pulpit, a most extraordinary scene presented itself. He beheld 3 adults only present, while the church was nearly filled with children, brats. The latter lay perfectly flat as if sound asleep, but the moment Farel began to preach they jumped up as puppets do when the string is pulled, and began to sing and dance, to laugh and scream. Farel's voice was completely drowned by the noise. This scene continued for some time. At length, the little ragamuffins made their exit in an uproar of screaming and howling. Farel was now left in quiet, but with no one to listen to him. And this, says a popish chronicler, was the first sermon preached in the town of Orb. Nevertheless, the reformer persevered. Soon a small but select number of converts gathered round him, some of them on good position in society. On Pentecost, the 28th of May, Farel celebrated the Lord's Supper for the first time in Orb, to a little congregation of 7. Having preached in the morning, the bread and wine were placed on the table, and the communicants received them kneeling. Farel demanded of them whether they forgave one another, and receiving an affirmative reply, he distributed the elements to them. In the afternoon the papists entered the church, and commenced the chanting of Mass. Farel was beginning to think that Orb was already won, when unhappily this bright prospect was suddenly dashed by the indiscreet zeal of one of the evangelists. Thinking to reform Orb by a coup de main, this person, with the help of 12 companions, pulled down one day all of the images in its 7 churches. The destruction of the idols but prolonged the reign of idolatry. A reaction set in, and it was not till 20 years thereafter that Orb placed itself in the rank of reformed cities. But if Orb remained Roman, it had the honor of giving to the Reformation one of its loveliest spirits and most persuasive preachers. Peter Farel was born in this town in 1511. His father was a wool dresser, sweet, studious, and of elevated soul. The son gave himself to the service of the altar. He was educated at the Sorbonne in Paris, where he remained about 3 years. He attained the peace of the gospel, like most of the reformers, by passing through the waters of anguish. But in his case, the floods were not as deep as in that of Luther and Calvin. When he returned to his native city, he entered the pulpit at the entreaty of Farel, and preached to his townsmen. The sweetness of his voice, the beauty of his ideas, and the modesty of his manner held his hearers captive. It was seen that he who distributes to his servants as he pleases for the edification of the body, the church, had given to Farel his special gift. He did not possess the glowing imagery and burning ardor of Luther, nor the fiery energy of Farel, nor the thrilling power of Zwingli, nor the calm, towering, and all-mastering genius of Calvin. But his preaching, nevertheless, had a charm which was not found in that of any of those great men. Clear, tender, persuasive, aided by the silvery tones of his voice, and the moral glow which lighted up his features. Its singular fascination and power were attested, in later years, by the immense crowds which gathered round him in Switzerland and the south of France, whenever he stood up to preach. He was indeed a polished shaft in the hand of the Almighty. Farel had to fall back from Orb, but if he retreated, it was to wage fresh combats and to win new victories. He next visited Grandson, at the western extremity of the lake of Neuchatel. The priests, alarmed at his arrival, rose in arms and drove him away. Bern now interposed its authority for his protection. Their excellencies would compel no one to become a Protestant, but they were determined to permit the 2 faiths to be heard, and the citizens to make their choice between the sermon and the Mass. Taking with him Farel, Farel returned to Grandson, where he was joined by a third, de Glutinus, an evangelist from the Bernese Jura. They preached Sunday and weekday. The heresy was breaking in like a torrent. The priests strove to rear a bulwark against the devastating flood. They refuted, to the best of their ability, the Protestant sermons. They called to their aid popular preachers from the neighboring towns, and they organized processions and sacred chants to invigorate the zeal and piety of their adherents. The tide, notwithstanding, continued to set in a contrary direction than they hoped for. Arming themselves, they came to the church to refute what they heard spoken there, not with arguments, but with blows. The sacristan threatened Farel with a pistol which he had concealed under his cloak. Another attempted to assassinate Glutinus with a poniard. The ministers managed to mount the pulpits, but were pulled from them, thrown down on the floor, trampled on, beaten, and when their friends rushed forward to defend them, the two parties fought over the prostrate bodies, and a regular battle was seen going forward in the church. But a great good resulted from these lamentable proceedings. The matter was brought before the great conference, which assembled, as we have previously related, at Bern in January 1532. The Swiss were drifting toward a civil war. It was hopeless to think of conciliating the two parties that divided the nation. But was it necessary that they should cut one another's throats? Might not it be possible, rather, to bear with one another's opinions? This was the device hit upon. It might appear to Rome, as it still appears to her, an execrable one, but to the conference it appeared preferable to the crime and horror of internecine strife. Thus, out of that necessity which is said to be the mother of invention, came the idea of toleration. We deem the mass idolatry, said Protestant Bern, but we shall prevent no one going to it. We deem the Protestant sermon heresy, rejoined Popish Freeburg, but we shall give liberty to all who wish to attend it. Thus, on the basis of liberty of worship, was the public peace maintained. This dates in Switzerland from January 1532. Toleration was adopted as a policy before it had been accepted as a principle. It was practiced as a necessity of the state before it had been promulgated as a right of conscience. It was only when it came to be recognized and claimed in the later character as a right founded on the divine charter, namely the Word of God, and held irrespective of the permission or the interdiction of man, that toleration established inviolably its existence and reign. In this manner Farel carried on the campaign. Every hour he encountered new perils. Every day there awaited him fresh persecutions. But it more than consoled him to think that he was winning victory after victory. He remembered that similar foes had beset the path of the first preachers of the gospel in the cities of Asia Minor at the beginning of the Christian dispensation, to those which obstructed his own in the towns and villages of this region. But in the face of that opposition, how marvelous had his success been! Not his, but that of the invisible power that was moving before him. Among the towns won to the gospel, the beginning of his strength, he could count Neuchatel, and Valingen, and Morat, and Granson, and Aigle, and Bex, and partially Orb. Every day the fields were growing ripe unto the harvest. Able and zealous laborers were coming to his aid in the reaping of it. By and by he hoped to carry home the last sheaf in the conversion of the little town which nestled at the southern extremity of the Leman Lake, to which his longing eyes were so often turned. What joy would be his, could he pluck it from the talons of Savoy and the grasp of Rome, and give it to the gospel. Chapter 5. Farel enters Geneva. Basin of the Rhone, Leman Lake, grandeur of its environs. The region in former times a stronghold of popery. Geneva. The Duke of Savoy entreats the Emperor to put him in possession of it. The hour passes. Farel enters Geneva. Preaches. The perfect liberty. the Great Pardon, beginning of a new Geneva, terror of the priests, Farel and Saunière summoned before the council, protected by letters from Bern, a tumult, Farel narrowly escapes death, is sent away from Geneva. Froment comes in his room, begins as schoolmaster, his New Year's Day sermon, popular agitation, retires from Geneva. There is no grander valley in Switzerland than the basin of the Rhone, whose collected floods, confined with smiling shores, form the Leman. As one looks toward sunrise, he sees on his right the majestic line of the White Alps, and on his left the picturesque and verdant Jura. The vast space which these magnificent chains enclose is variously filled in. The grandest feature is the lake. It is blue as the sky and motionless as a mirror. Nestling on its shores or dotting its remoter banks is many a beautiful villa, many a picturesque town, almost drowned in the affluent foliage of gardens and rich vines, which clothe the country that slopes upward in an easy swell toward the mountains. In the remoter distance the eye ranges over the vast stretch of pasture lands and corn fields, and forests of chestnuts and pine trees. Above the dark woods soar the great peaks, as finely robed as the plains, though after a different manner, not with flowers and verdure, but with glaciers and snows. But this fertile and lovely land, at the time we write of, was one of the strongholds of the papacy. Cathedrals, abbacies, rich convents, and famous shrines, which attracted yearly troops of pilgrims, were thickly planted throughout the valley of the Leman. These were so many fortresses by which Rome kept the country in subjection. In each of these fortresses was placed a numerous garrison. Priests and monks swarmed like the locusts. The land was fat, yet one wonders how it sustained so numerous and ravenous a host. In Geneva alone there were 900 priests. In the other towns and villages around the lake and at the foot of the Jura, they were not less numerous in proportion. Cowls and shorn crowns, frocks and veils were seen everywhere. This generation of tonsured men and veiled women formed the church, and the dues they had exacted of the lay population, and the processions, chants, exorcisms, and blows which they gave them in return, were styled religion. The man who would go down into this region of sevenfold blackness and attack these sons of the Roman Anak, who here tyrannized so mercilessly over their wretched victims, had indeed need of a stout heart and a strong faith. He had need to be clad in the armor of God in going forth to such a battle. This man was William Farel. The spiritual campaigns of the 16th century produced few such champions. His sermons, says de Bigny, were actions quite as much as a battle is. We have already chronicled what he did in these wars of the Lord in the Pays de Vaud. We are now to be engaged in the narrative of his work in Geneva.
Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.